The conference room went silent when Brian Harris said the one sentence nobody in that glass-walled boardroom wanted to hear. Do not sign it. Monica Gray, the white female CEO of one of the fastest-growing food companies in the state, looked up from the polished table as if a janitor had interrupted a surgery. Around her sat investors, executives, attorneys, and Carl Jennings, the loan broker with the perfect gray suit and the too-perfect smile. The man who had spent 3 weeks promising that this financing package would save Monica Gray Foods from slowing down. Brian stood near the end of the table in a wrinkled blue shirt, a cheap tie, and shoes that had been polished so many times the leather had started to crack. He was only the risk compliance assistant, a single dad who usually checked boxes, filed reports, and stayed invisible. But on that morning, with a school backpack resting on the chair beside him and his daughter Ava's library book about money sticking halfway out of it, he held up one page from the loan packet like it weighed more than the entire company. Monica's eyes narrowed. Brian, this meeting is for senior leadership. Carl gave a quiet laugh, just loud enough for the others to hear. He probably saw the word default and panicked. It happens with people who do not understand growth debt. A few executives looked away. One of them smirked. Brian did not raise his voice. He simply placed the loan clause page with balloon default trigger on the table and turned it toward Monica. This clause does not just raise the repayment schedule, he said. It creates an automatic default if projected inventory financing drops below a ratio they control, not you. The balloon payment accelerates before your new distribution revenue clears. If you sign this today, they can call the debt early, seize operating accounts, and force a restructuring that removes you from control. The room stayed quiet for half a second. Then Carl leaned back, smiling wider. That is a dramatic interpretation from an assistant. Monica closed the folder in front of her. Her face stayed calm, but her voice turned cold. Brian, you were asked to process the compliance memo, not sabotage a financing round. Brian glanced at the backpack on the chair. Ava had drawn a small heart on the corner of her notebook that morning before school, right beside a sticky note that said, Dad, remember my library book. He had promised her he would return it by 5. He had also promised himself he would never teach his daughter that silence was safer than truth. I am not sabotaging anything, he said. I am documenting a risk. Carl's smile faded for just a moment, but Monica did not notice. She was staring at Brian as if his calmness offended her more than his warning. Do you understand what is at stake? She asked. This company has 200 employees waiting on this expansion. Farmers, drivers, plant workers, families. You are standing here with a page you barely have authority to review, telling me to walk away from the capital that keeps them employed. Brian swallowed. The accusation landed exactly where it was meant to land. He knew what it meant to count grocery dollars at night. He knew what it meant to choose between a car repair and a school trip. He knew what a paycheck meant to families who did not have backup plans. That was why he had read the clause 3 times before dawn while Ava ate cereal across from him and sounded out the title of her library book about money. Yes, he said softly. That is why I am saying it before you sign. Carl pushed the document back toward Monica with 2 fingers. This is fear talking, not finance. Monica stood, and the whole room seemed to stand with her power. Brian Harris, she said, you are no longer assigned to this transaction. Brian did not move. She looked at security near the door, then back at him. Actually, you are no longer employed here. Someone exhaled sharply. Someone else looked down at the table. Carl adjusted his cuff like the matter had been handled. Brian picked up the backpack, carefully sliding Ava's library book about money back inside so the pages would not bend. Then he reached for the loan clause page with balloon default trigger. Monica stopped him. Leave the company documents. Brian paused, his hand still on the page. For the first time, Carl's confidence flickered. Brian noticed it. He let go of the paper, but not before looking once at the tiny line near the bottom. The line Carl had been hoping no one would understand until it was too late. Then Brian nodded, turned toward the door, and walked out with nothing but his daughter's backpack, his quiet dignity, and one detail in his memory that would soon make the same room wish they had listened. By the time Brian Harris reached the curb outside Monica Gray Foods, the cold morning air felt quieter than the boardroom had. He did not slam a door, curse Carl Jennings, or call anyone to complain. He just stood beside his old pickup, set Ava's backpack on the passenger seat, and checked the time. The school library closed at 4:30. Rent was due Friday. The electric bill was folded behind the sun visor with a red notice across the top, and the grocery list in his coat pocket had already been crossed down to bread, eggs, apples, rice, and the smallest pack of chicken he could stretch for 3 dinners. Being fired should have felt like thunder, but for Brian, pressure rarely arrived as thunder. It arrived as math. $27 in checking until his last paycheck cleared. 1 tank of gas if he drove carefully. 2 lunches packed from leftovers. 1 daughter waiting at school with a library book about money that she was proud to return on time because, as she had told him that morning, late fees are like tiny debts, Dad. He smiled at that, but only for a second. Then he opened the glove box, took out the small spiral notebook where he kept every receipt, every mileage record, every call log, and every appointment, and wrote 1 sentence. Terminated after refusing to process loan approval memo due to balloon default trigger clause. No emotion, no accusation, just the record. That was how Brian survived low-status rooms. People with power could raise their voices. People like him kept proof. At 3:15, he parked outside Ava's school, changed out of his tie in the truck, and rolled his sleeves down so she would not see the stress in the way his hands moved. Ava climbed in with her lunchbox, her purple notebook, and the library book about money hugged against her chest like treasure. "Did your big meeting go okay?" she asked. Brian looked through the windshield at the buses pulling away. "It got complicated," he said, "but I told the truth." Ava nodded as if that answered everything. At home, their apartment smelled faintly of dish soap and toast. The kitchen table had 1 wobbly leg, so Brian folded a piece of cardboard under it before Ava started her homework. He sorted mail while she copied spelling words. Insurance notice, rent reminder, school fundraiser envelope. A coupon for cereal he would only use if the store brand was not cheaper. His phone buzzed twice with messages from former coworkers, both careful, both scared. "I'm sorry, man. That was brutal." Then another. "Carl is saying you misunderstood the document." Brian placed the phone face down. He did not need sympathy. He needed clean records. From a folder under the sink, hidden behind extra trash bags and a flashlight, he pulled his personal compliance notes, the permitted copies of public financing drafts, and the call timestamps he had logged when Carl Jennings changed the repayment language after legal review. On top was the same kind of page he had left behind in the boardroom. A loan clause page with balloon default trigger, marked with a yellow tab and 1 small underline near the words accelerated obligation. He had not stolen anything. He had copied only what policy allowed him to retain as work product notes during review. But he knew the difference between having a feeling and having a timeline. Carl had counted on everyone being too busy, too impressed, or too afraid to read the trap slowly. Brian read everything slowly because his life had taught him that small print was where expensive pain liked to hide. "Dad," Ava said from the table, "my book says money is a tool. Is that true?" Brian looked at the bills, the grocery list, the rent reminder, and the clause that could have emptied a company's accounts before its revenue arrived. "Yes," he said, "but some people use tools to build, and some people use them to take things apart." Ava frowned at her worksheet. "How do you know the difference?" Brian picked up the loan clause page with balloon default trigger and slid it into a plain folder, careful not to bend the corner. "You follow what the tool does after nobody is watching." That night, after dinner, after Ava brushed her teeth, after he signed her reading log, and placed her library book by the door, Brian sat alone under the yellow kitchen light and rebuilt the timeline minute by minute. The first draft had been aggressive but legal. The second draft had added a ratio trigger. The third had changed who measured the ratio. The final version, the one Monica almost signed, gave Carl's lending group the power to declare default before the expansion could generate cash. Brian stopped writing when he noticed one entry he had almost missed. The clause had been inserted 12 minutes after Monica's attorney left the negotiation call. And beside that timestamp was a file name with Carl Jennings' initials embedded in the revision code. Inside Monica Gray Foods, power did not look like greed. It looked like clean glass walls, spotless conference tables, factory dashboards glowing with production targets, and executives speaking in calm voices while everything underneath them moved too fast. Monica Gray had built the company from a regional brand into a name investors finally respected, and now every room she entered carried the same pressure: expand or get swallowed. In the factory control room, Supervisors warned that new supermarket contracts would require 3 additional production lines. In the legal office, attorneys circled deadlines in red. In the investor room, men and women with expensive watches asked whether Monica could scale before a national competitor copied her distribution model. On paper, the answer was yes. The purchase orders were real. The demand was real. The growth was real. What Monica did not have was time. That was the weakness Carl Jennings understood better than anyone. He never arrived looking like a villain. He arrived with numbers, options, and a voice so smooth it made danger sound like strategy. This is not rescue money, Carl told Monica that afternoon, standing beside a screen filled with charts. This is acceleration capital. You are not borrowing because you are weak. You are borrowing because the market is finally catching up to you. The CFO nodded, half convinced, because the charts did show revenue rising. The operations director looked relieved, because the loan would fund equipment. The legal team was exhausted, because every negotiation had already taken too long. And Monica, who had spent years being underestimated, heard the one thing every builder wants to hear when the walls are closing in. You are not in trouble. You are on the edge of something bigger. On the table in front of her sat the final loan packet, clipped, indexed, and ready for signature. Near the back, almost hidden beneath schedules, definitions, and lender rights, was the loan clause page with balloon default trigger. No one stared at it for long. To Monica, it looked like another dense page of financial language, the kind lawyers always warned about and then approved after edits. To Carl, it looked like a locked door only he had the key to. He kept his hand near that section whenever questions came close to it, tapping the paper lightly, redirecting attention toward the headline number, the funding date, the expansion plan, the jobs that would be protected. The risk, he said, is hesitation. Those words landed hard because hesitation had always been the insult thrown at Monica by men who thought she was too cautious, too emotional, too careful with cash. So when Brian Harris had stood in the boardroom and said, "Do not sign it," she did not hear a warning. She heard another small voice trying to slow her down. Now, hours after firing him, she stood above the factory floor and watched workers move pallets under bright industrial lights. 200 employees, drivers, bakers, warehouse staff, quality control teams, people who trusted her decisions without ever reading the contracts behind them. Her phone buzzed with a message from Carl. "We should close before end of day tomorrow. Delay creates lender concern." Monica looked through the glass at the machines and told herself Brian had been afraid because people with small lives often feared large moves. But in the legal office downstairs, one junior attorney frowned at a revision history. That did not match the version she remembered. In accounting, an analyst noticed a cash flow projection had been adjusted without a clear note. And in Carl Jennings' briefcase, beneath a leather folder and a silver pen, sat a second copy of the loan clause page with balloon default trigger, marked not with concern, but with a small check beside the exact line Brian had pointed to before they removed him from the room. Brian Harris did not return to Monica Gray Foods the next morning to beg for his job. He returned because the system still showed his compliance login attached to the loan file, and if the approval memo moved forward under his name, the record would make it look like he had signed off on the very thing he had refused. At 7:12 a.m., before most executives arrived, he stood at a small terminal outside the legal office, wearing the same modest coat, holding a paper cup of gas station coffee, and reviewing the final upload history line by line. The building around him was already awake, forklifts beeping in the loading bay, phones ringing in accounting, assistants rushing between conference rooms with folders tucked under their arms. Brian opened the financing package, compared it to the earlier draft, and froze when he saw the risk summary field. The AI review tool had labeled the loan as standard growth capital with manageable covenant exposure. That sentence was wrong. Not just vague. Wrong. The tool had scanned the document, but it had missed the way the repayment acceleration connected to the inventory ratio definition buried 3 pages later. A human could miss it too, if he was tired, rushed, or paid to look away. Brian clicked deeper into the file, pulled up the loan clause page with balloon default trigger, and checked the metadata. There it was again, a revision code tied to Carl Jennings' office, inserted after legal review, then repackaged as if it had already been cleared. Brian printed the comparison page, not because he wanted drama, but because records mattered more than confidence. As the printer hummed, his phone lit up with a photo from Ava's school tablet. Her library book about money sitting on her desk beside a note that said, "Dad, my teacher says proof is how you show your work." Brian stared at the picture longer than he meant to. He imagined Ava standing in the school library, carefully returning the book on time, believing adults told the truth because that was what adults were supposed to do. Then Monica's voice cut across the hallway. "Why are you in my building?" Brian turned. Monica Gray stood with two executives behind her, dressed for another investor meeting, controlled and sharp, but her eyes were tired in a way the boardroom had not shown. Carl Jennings stepped out from the conference room behind her, and the moment he saw the printed comparison page in Brian's hand, his expression tightened before he smoothed it over. "This is exactly what I warned you about," Carl said. "Disgruntled employees create confusion around clean transactions." Brian kept his voice low. "The AI summary is reading the clause in isolation. It does not connect the balloon trigger to the lender-controlled ratio definition. Someone changed the sequence after legal review." Monica held out her hand. "Give me the papers." Brian did not move quickly. He placed the printout on the counter between them and pointed to the timestamp. "This is not my opinion. This is the version history." One of the executives leaned in, but Carl spoke first. "He is not authorized to access that file anymore." Brian looked at Monica. "My login is still attached to the approval memo. If the company signs today, the record will show I processed the risk clearance. I came to remove my name and document why." Monica's jaw tightened. In her world, timing was everything. Lenders were waiting. Investors were watching. Employees needed certainty. And here was Brian again, calm in the most inconvenient way, turning one small page into a wall she could not easily step around. "You were terminated," she said. "You do not get to walk into my company and undermine a closing because you dislike the terms." Brian's phone buzzed again. This time it was Ava's school calling. He ignored it once, then saw the second call and answered softly. Ava's voice came through small and shaken. She had forgotten her signed reading log, and the librarian said she might not be able to check out the next book. It was a tiny problem, but Brian heard the embarrassment in her voice, the way a child feels when rules become larger than she is. "It is okay," he told her. "I wrote it down. I will fix it." When he ended the call, Monica's expression flickered, but Carl used the moment. "This is not professional. He brings personal chaos into financial decisions." Brian picked up Ava's backpack from the floor near his feet, the library book about money visible through the open zipper, and for the first time his calm looked heavy. "Personal chaos is why I read the fine print," he said. "Because people without cushions do not survive traps designed by people with options." The hallway went still. Monica's face hardened again, not because the words were loud, but because they landed too close to something she did not want to admit. She turned to security at the front desk. "Escort Mr. Harris out. If he comes back into this building without written authorization, remove him for trespassing." Carl looked relieved. Brian looked once more at the loan clause page with balloon default trigger lying on the counter, then at the revision timestamp he had circled in black ink. He did not argue. He only said, "Then make sure someone honest reads that before the signature." And as security stepped toward him, the junior attorney from downstairs appeared at the end of the hall holding a second folder, her face pale, as if she had just found the same thing. The junior attorney's folder did not save Brian Harris in that hallway, but it changed the air around him. She did not speak loudly. She only handed Monica Gray a printed comparison page and said, "There is a discrepancy in the final loan packet." Monica took the paper without looking at Brian, as if admitting his presence might admit too much. Carl Jennings moved half a step closer, his smile returning, but thinner now. "Draft noise," he said. "It happens when files move between counsel, lender portals, and internal review tools." That explanation sounded reasonable enough to powerful people who wanted the meeting to continue, and dangerous enough to quiet the people who knew. It might not be true. Brian stood beside security with Ava's backpack in one hand, the strap twisted around his fingers. Through the open zipper, the corner of her library book about money showed a cartoon piggy bank on the cover, a strange little symbol of innocence in a hallway full of adults pretending not to see a trap. Monica scanned the page quickly. "What exactly are we looking at?" The junior attorney hesitated, and that was all Carl needed. An assistant creating confusion over formatting, he said. The actual economics have not changed. Brian did not interrupt. He had learned that people listen less when you sound desperate, and he had nothing left to protect except the record. But his eyes went to the page in Monica's hand, to the place where the loan clause page with balloon default trigger had been summarized in the comparison. One tiny detail sat there like a loose wire. The definition of eligible inventory value had changed from borrower certified to lender determined. 4 words, not a paragraph, not a headline. Just 4 words slipped into a definition most executives would never read because it sounded like accounting furniture, dull and harmless. But Brian understood what those 4 words did. They moved the measuring stick out of Monica's hands and into the lender's. If the company produced more, bought more ingredients, or shifted stock ahead of the new supermarket launch, the lender could decide the inventory value no longer satisfied the ratio. That decision would activate the balloon default trigger, accelerate the entire payment, and make Monica Gray Foods look insolvent even while orders were growing. It was not a normal loan risk. It was a lever. Brian looked at Monica and said, calmly, "Ask who gets to define the inventory value after closing." Carl gave a short laugh. "This is not a classroom." Brian kept his eyes on Monica. "Ask who calculates it, when they calculate it, and whether their number can trigger acceleration before receivables clear." The CFO shifted in place. One executive looked down at his shoes. The junior attorney turned back to her folder, searching. For the first time, Monica did not immediately dismiss the question. She looked at the comparison again, and Brian could see her reading the words in the order he had read them. Lender determined, quarterly test, immediate acceleration, unpaid principal due. Carl stepped in smoothly. "Monica, with respect, this is exactly why we do not let terminated staff interpret senior debt documents in a hallway. Every growth loan has lender protections. That does not make it predatory." Monica's face tightened at the word predatory, not because Brian had said it, but because Carl had said it too quickly. Still, pressure is a powerful editor. It cuts away doubt and leaves only deadlines. Her phone buzzed. The investors were arriving in 40 minutes. The equipment vendor wanted confirmation. The plant expansion schedule was already public. A delay would ripple through payroll, suppliers, and the market rumor mill before lunch. Brian saw that calculation pass across her face. He knew it because he made smaller versions of it every week. Pay the bill now or keep cash for groceries. Fix the truck or risk missing school pickup. Speak now or keep the job. Monica handed the page back to the junior attorney. "Review it internally," she said, but her tone had already moved on. Then she looked at security. "Mr. Harris still needs to leave." Ava's school called again, the screen lighting up in Brian's hand. He ignored it this time, not because he cared less, but because he suddenly understood the tiny detail was bigger than his job. The loan clause page with balloon default trigger was not merely a bad clause. It was a trap designed to look ordinary until the moment it closed. Brian turned toward the exit, then stopped just long enough to say, "If the person measuring the ratio profits when you fail, the clause is not protection. It is a loaded scale." No one answered. Carl looked at the floor. Monica looked through the glass wall toward the boardroom where her signature folder waited. And Brian walked out knowing the most important sentence in the document had finally been spoken aloud, even if the people with power were still pretending they had not heard it. By noon, the pressure inside Monica Gray Foods had stopped feeling like business and started feeling like a countdown. The investor call had been moved up 2 hours because rumors were already leaking that the financing package had been delayed. The equipment vendor wanted a non-refundable deposit by close of day, or the new production line would go to another buyer. The factory manager warned that without that line, the supermarket launch would miss its delivery window, and if that happened, penalty fees would hit before the first shipment ever left the dock. In accounting, payroll was technically covered, but only if the company did not tie up cash in emergency supplier payments. In legal, the junior attorney kept the comparison file open on her screen, staring at the same 4 words Brian Harris had pointed to, unable to prove intent, but unable to ignore the pattern. And in the boardroom, Carl Jennings looked more composed than anyone. That was what bothered the CFO first. Carl should have been annoyed by the delay. Instead, he looked almost patient, as if every hour of panic pushed Monica closer to the signature line. "The market does not reward uncertainty," Carl said, standing near the screen where the final loan terms glowed in neat columns. Your company is healthy, Monica, but growth companies can die from hesitation. This facility gives you speed. Monica sat at the head of the table, her jacket still buttoned, her phone lighting up every few minutes with messages from investors, suppliers, and senior staff. She had built this company by making hard decisions while other people asked for more time. Now everyone wanted time. Legal wanted another review. Accounting wanted a revised cash flow model. The CFO wanted outside counsel to inspect the inventory ratio language. Even the junior attorney, who rarely spoke unless asked, finally said, "The balloon default trigger may be more sensitive than the lender represented." Carl turned toward her with a soft, practiced expression. Sensitive does not mean dangerous. It means disciplined. Lenders protect themselves so borrowers can access larger capital. He looked back at Monica. And frankly, if your team cannot manage a basic inventory covenant, that is an operations issue, not a loan issue. The sentence landed like a challenge. Monica's eyes hardened. No CEO wants to be told her company is not disciplined enough to handle growth. No founder wants outsiders to smell fear. Across the room, the factory dashboard flashed a warning. Line 3 maintenance overdue. Not critical yet, but soon. The operations director whispered that a shutdown, even a partial one, would give competitors an opening. Carl let the silence stretch, then placed his own folder on the table. There is another option if the board becomes uncomfortable. My lending group has partners who can provide bridge capital in exchange for temporary control rights. You avoid collapse, but leadership oversight changes. The CFO looked up sharply. Monica did too. It sounded like help, but for the first time she heard the metal underneath it. Temporary control rights. Oversight changes. A polite way to say that if the company stumbled, someone else would get to hold the steering wheel. That was the hidden shape of the deal beginning to show through the paper. If Monica signed and the lender later declared a default using the lender-determined inventory value, the balloon payment could accelerate. If she could not pay, Carl's partners could step in with bridge money. If they stepped in, ownership influence could shift without anyone ever calling it a takeover. And Carl Jennings, the broker who pushed the terms, would profit either way. Commission if she signed, leverage if she failed, and access to the company's control structure if panic made her desperate. But Monica did not let that thought fully form. Not yet. Pride and fear were both speaking too loudly. She remembered Brian Harris standing in the hallway with Ava's backpack, saying the clause was a loaded scale. She remembered firing him in front of people who now avoided her eyes. She remembered the loan clause page with balloon default trigger sitting on the table like an accusation. Then her phone rang. The lead investor wanted confirmation before the market closed. Monica looked at the factory feed, the cash forecast, the legal memo, and Carl's calm face. "We are not letting one fired assistant derail this company," she said. "Legal can document the concern after closing. We move forward today." The moment Monica Gray said, "We move forward today," Brian Harris was already standing in the lobby below, trying to explain to the front desk that he only needed the termination packet with his personal belongings. Ava stood beside him because her school had closed early for a teacher meeting, and there had been no one else to pick her up. She wore her backpack with the library book about money tucked under one arm, quiet in the way children get quiet when they understand adults are angry, but not why. Through the glass walls above them, executives crossed the second-floor walkway toward the investor room. Brian looked up just as Carl Jennings appeared beside Monica, speaking close to her ear, guiding her back toward the deal like a man leading someone away from a fire alarm. Then the elevator opened, and 2 security guards stepped out with a cardboard box holding Brian's desk items: a cracked coffee mug, a framed photo of Ava at a school fair, 3 notebooks of compliance checklists, and the small calculator he used because he trusted buttons more than dashboards. One of the guards looked uncomfortable. The other said, "Mr. Harris, you are not permitted past the lobby." Before Brian could answer, Carl came down the stairs with an executive from legal and a public relations manager who looked terrified of loose ends. "This is becoming disruptive," Carl said, loud enough for the receptionist, the security guards, and 2 delivery drivers to hear. "You were terminated for refusing to perform your assigned function and for spreading unsupported financial claims." Ava looked up at her father. Her face changed at the word terminated. Brian set the cardboard box on the bench slowly, as if sudden movement might embarrass her more. I refused to certify a document I believed was materially misleading, he said. Carl gave a small, polished laugh. You believed. That is the problem. Belief is not compliance. The PR manager avoided eye contact. The legal executive held out a form. Sign this acknowledgement and leave the premises. Brian read it once. Then again. It stated he had been removed for failure to follow procedure, unauthorized interference with financing activities, and creating reputational risk. Reputational risk. Not the clause. Not the trigger. Not the revision history. Just him. Ava's fingers tightened around the library book about money until the cover bent slightly. Brian noticed and gently touched the book to flatten it. Careful, he whispered. We return things better than we found them. That tiny sentence made Carl smirk. That is a nice principle. Maybe apply it to company time. Several people in the lobby heard it. Someone at reception looked down. A delivery driver stared at the floor. Brian felt the heat of humiliation rise up his neck, but he did not give Carl the satisfaction of seeing it become anger. He took the acknowledgement form, turned it over, and used the blank side to write one line in neat block letters. I warned the company that the loan clause page with balloon default trigger transfers default power through lender-determined inventory valuation. Then he signed only beneath that sentence, not beneath the accusation. The legal executive blinked. You cannot modify the form. Then I cannot sign it, Brian said. Monica reached the lobby halfway through the exchange. She had come down because the investor call had been delayed by a technical issue, and perhaps because some part of her wanted to see the disturbance end with her own eyes. Ava saw her too and stepped a little closer to Brian. Monica's gaze moved from the child to the library book, then to Brian's box of belongings. For 1 second, her controlled expression softened. Carl noticed and moved in quickly. He is trying to manufacture a record after the fact, he said. This is how disgruntled employees protect themselves. Brian looked at Monica, not Carl. The document is not dangerous because it has a balloon payment, he said calmly. It is dangerous because someone else controls the number that decides when the balloon drops. The lobby became still. Even Ava seemed to understand that her father had said the most important thing he could say. Monica held his gaze, and Brian thought maybe, finally, the warning had reached the person who needed it. But then her phone lit up with the investor name, the deadline, the pressure, the whole machine of growth demanding a decision. She looked away first. Escort him out, she said, quieter than before. Brian picked up the box with one arm and held Ava's hand with the other. As they walked through the automatic doors, Carl turned back toward the elevator, already speaking about closing documents and reputational discipline. The lobby returned to motion. The investor call reconnected. The factory kept running. The loan packet remained on the boardroom table, neat and signed in all the places that looked important. For the next few hours, everything seemed stable. For 3 hours after Brian Harris walked out with Ava's hand in his, Monica Gray Foods looked like a company that had survived an inconvenience. The investor call reconnected. Carl Jennings congratulated Monica on decisive leadership. The legal team filed the signed documents into the closing folder. The factory lights stayed bright. The production lines kept moving, and the first vendor deposit was scheduled before the afternoon wire cutoff. From the outside, nothing had broken. That was the cruelest part of a financial trap. It did not always snap shut with noise. Sometimes it waited politely until everyone relaxed. The first sign came from accounting at 4:18 p.m. when a routine treasury screen showed the operating account marked for lender review. The controller assumed it was a standard post-closing hold and called the bank. The bank officer sounded confused, then careful. The lender has requested confirmation of eligible inventory value before releasing the next tranche, she said. The controller walked the message to the CFO, who walked it to legal, who walked it to Monica. Carl was still in the building, still calm, still saying this was normal. They are just validating collateral, he explained. It will clear. But 20 minutes later, the factory purchasing system rejected a supplier payment for packaging materials. Then payroll's test batch returned a warning, pending liquidity verification. Then the equipment vendor called, not angry yet, but close, asking why the deposit had not arrived. Experts began doing what experts do under pressure. Legal reviewed definitions. Accounting rebuilt the cash model. Treasury called the bank again. Operations checked inventory counts. The CFO opened 3 spreadsheets at once and tried to prove the company was solvent in a language the lender would accept. Everyone had a title. Everyone had experience. But every answer led back to the same buried mechanism Brian had warned about. The loan clause page with balloon default trigger. The clause did not say the company had failed. It allowed the lender to question whether the inventory counted the way Monica thought it counted. That question alone froze enough movement to hurt. Downstairs, the junior attorney who had found the discrepancy sat in a side office with 2 versions of the loan packet open on her monitors. Her name was Erin Vale, and until that day, most executives knew her only as the quiet associate who carried folders and highlighted signature tabs. She was not invited to strategy calls. She did not speak in investor meetings. But she had one habit that Brian would have respected. She saved revision histories before cleaning up document files. Erin compared the final clause to the earlier draft and noticed the same tiny phrase Brian had circled, lender determined. Then she noticed something else. The definition of inventory value did not just allow the lender to measure the number. It allowed the lender to exclude inventory tied to new purchase orders until payment was received. Monica's entire expansion model depended on producing first and collecting later. That meant the more the company grew, the weaker the ratio could appear on paper. Erin's mouth went dry. She opened the closing checklist and found Carl Jennings' certification attached above the clause, stating that no material covenant changes had been made after legal review. But the timestamp disagreed. At 5:06 p.m., the lender sent a formal notice requesting updated inventory valuation before funds could fully release. At 5:11, payroll called the CFO again. At 5:14, the factory manager warned that if supplier payments did not clear by morning, production line 2 would slow by noon. Carl stopped smiling only when Erin entered the boardroom with the printed revision log in her hand. Monica was standing at the window, phone pressed to her ear, listening to an investor ask why a lender review had appeared 1 hour after closing. Her face stayed controlled, but her knuckles had gone white around the phone. Carl reached for Erin's papers before Monica could see them. "I will handle that," he said. Erin did not hand them over. She looked at Monica instead. "Brian Harris was not guessing," she said. "The clause was changed after approval, and the trigger can freeze operating funds before the company technically defaults." The room went quiet, not because everyone understood yet, but because the lowest-ranking person in the room had just repeated the warning they had escorted out the door. Monica lowered the phone slowly. For the first time all day, Carl Jennings looked less like a broker and more like a man standing too close to a locked drawer someone had found the key to. The first person to say Brian Harris's name was not Monica Gray. It was Erin Vale, the junior attorney standing at the end of the boardroom table with a revision log in one hand and the loan clause page with balloon default trigger in the other. She said it quietly, but the silence around her made it sound loud. Brian Harris was right about the mechanism. No one moved. The CFO looked from Erin to Carl Jennings, then back to the frozen treasury screen where the lender review notice still blinked like a small red wound. Monica Gray stood near the window, her phone lowered in her hand, her reflection faintly visible in the glass above the factory floor she had spent years building. For most of the day, Brian had been a disruption, a stubborn assistant, a single dad with a wrinkled shirt and a child's backpack at his feet, standing in rooms where people with titles believed they understood money better than he did. Now the same page he had tried to protect them from sat in the center of the table, and every expert in the room was finally reading it slowly. Erin pointed to the definition change. The lender does not have to wait for an actual missed payment. They can challenge eligible inventory value. If their valuation drops the ratio below the covenant threshold, the balloon payment accelerates. The CFO leaned closer. "But the inventory exists." Erin nodded. "Yes, but under this language, some of it can be excluded until receivables clear." The operations director's face drained. "That is our entire supermarket launch cycle." Carl lifted a hand, still trying to sound patient. "You are all turning a technical protection into a conspiracy. This is a standard lender safeguard." Monica looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw something she should have seen earlier. Carl was not alarmed by the freeze. He was not surprised by the timing. He was only concerned with controlling who explained it. The thought moved through her slowly, and with it came the memory of Brian standing in the lobby while Ava held her library book about money against her chest. watching adults call her father reckless because he refused to bless a trap. Monica remembered the sentence he had written on the back of the termination form. She remembered his calm warning. Someone else controls the number that decides when the balloon drops. At the time, it had sounded like bitterness dressed as expertise. Now it sounded like the simplest explanation in the room. The CFO opened the cash forecast again, this time under the lender's interpretation, and the numbers changed shape immediately. Not because the company was failing, but because the clause could make growth look like weakness. Supplier payments could stall. Payroll could tighten. The new production line could miss its deposit window. Investors could panic. And if Monica could not cure the technical default fast enough, Carl's so-called bridge partners would be waiting with temporary control rights. Monica placed both hands on the table. The polished surface felt cold. For the first time that day, power did not feel like control. It felt like being the last person in the room to understand the danger. Why did nobody flag this before closing? She asked. No one answered quickly. Legal blamed the final upload. Accounting blamed the late covenant schedule. The AI review tool had missed the cross-reference. The outside counsel had reviewed the earlier draft. Everyone had touched part of the truth, but Brian had been the only one who followed the trap from beginning to end. Aaron slid the loan clause page with balloon default trigger toward Monica. He marked the exact line, she said. He also noticed the timestamp. Carl's voice hardened. You are not seriously suggesting we bring back a terminated compliance assistant during a lender crisis. The CFO looked at Monica, then at the frozen account notice. We may not have a choice. The room absorbed that sentence differently than it had absorbed Brian's warning. This time, nobody laughed. Monica stared at the page, at the tiny language that had almost cost her the company, and said the words she never imagined saying 3 hours after firing him. Find Brian Harris. Aaron hesitated. And if he refuses to come? Monica looked toward the lobby doors where she had last seen him leave with his daughter's hand in his. Her voice dropped. Then I will go ask him myself. By 6:40 p.m., the crisis at Monica Gray Foods had escaped the conference room. A local business reporter posted that the company's expansion financing had triggered an unexpected lender review, and within minutes suppliers began calling, investors began texting, and employees on the factory floor started whispering the word shutdown before management had used it. The payroll batch was still pending. The packaging supplier refused to release tomorrow's shipment without confirmation of funds. The equipment vendor sent a final notice. Deposit by 8 p.m. or the production line would be reassigned. In the boardroom, the directors joined by emergency video call, their faces arranged in small glowing boxes on the screen, each one asking the same question in a different tone. Was Monica still in control of the company? Carl Jennings sat along the wall with his hands folded, no longer pretending this was routine. Now he spoke like a man offering rescue from a fire he had helped start. The lender is prepared to consider a bridge solution, he said. It would stabilize payroll and supplier obligations immediately, but the board would need to approve temporary oversight rights. The word temporary hung in the air like smoke. The CFO stared at the draft resolution and realized it did not just give the lender visibility. It gave Carl's affiliated partners emergency approval power over cash, inventory, and executive decisions if the default notice matured. Monica Gray stood at the head of the table, pale but steady, while outside the glass wall the factory slowed section by section. Not stopped. Not yet. But everyone could feel the machinery of the company losing rhythm. That was when Aaron Vale returned from the lobby and said, "He is here." Brian Harris did not enter like a hero. He entered carrying Ava's backpack over one shoulder and a plain folder under one arm, wearing the same tired coat, with his daughter beside him because the after-school program had closed and there was nowhere else for her to go. Ava held her library book about money against her chest, eyes wide at the room full of screens and strangers. Brian looked at Monica first, not with triumph, not with anger, but with the careful restraint of someone who had come back because the problem was bigger than his pride. I am here for 2 reasons, he said. My name is still attached to the compliance trail, and my daughter needs to see that when a record is wrong, you correct it. No one mocked him this time. The directors on screen leaned closer. Carl's jaw tightened. Monica stepped aside and placed the loan clause page with balloon default trigger in the center of the table. Show us, she said. Brian set down his folder, opened his notebook, and began with the timeline. He did not accuse first. He sequenced. Original draft, legal review, attorney exit, clause insertion, AI summary failure, lender determined valuation, post-closing freeze, bridge control proposal. Each point had a timestamp. Each timestamp had a document. Each document narrowed the room around Carl Jennings. The outside counsel on the video call interrupted twice, then stopped interrupting. The CFO rebuilt the cash model using Brian's interpretation, and the projected default appeared exactly where Brian said it would, not after business failure, but after lender reclassification. 1. Director muttered, "That is a control trap." Carl stood. "This is absurd. You are letting a fired assistant conduct a board investigation." Brian looked at him calmly. "No, I am showing the board where to look." Ava sat quietly near the wall, her backpack at her feet, watching her father speak in the same voice he used at the kitchen table when explaining bills, library due dates, and why small numbers mattered. Monica noticed that, and something in her expression changed. The emergency board vote was still on the agenda. The lender's freeze was still active. Payroll still might fail by morning. The public rumor had not vanished. But the room had shifted from panic to proof. Brian turned the loan clause page with balloon default trigger toward the camera so every director could see the line. "Before you vote on temporary control rights," he said, "ask why the person offering rescue inserted the condition that creates the emergency." For the first time, every face in the room turned toward Carl Jennings. Brian Harris did not raise his voice when the board asked him to explain the proof. He did not point at Carl Jennings and call him a liar. He did not look at Monica Gray as if she owed him an apology. He simply placed 3 documents on the boardroom table in a straight line: the original approved loan draft, the final signed packet, and the loan clause page with balloon default trigger. Then he turned the page toward the directors on the emergency video call so the camera could catch the small sentence everyone had skipped. "This is the hinge," he said. "Not the interest rate. Not the repayment date. This line." The room leaned in. Monica stood behind him with her arms folded, her face controlled but no longer certain. Ava sat near the wall with her library book about money open on her lap, not reading now, just watching the adults finally study the paper her father had carried like a warning flare all day. Brian tapped the definition of eligible inventory value. In the first draft, Monica Gray Foods certified its own inventory value using standard accounting records. That means if the company had product, purchase orders, and receivables, the company could show the value. In the final draft, that changed to lender-determined inventory value. That means the lender gets to decide what counts. The CFO nodded slowly, already following. Brian moved his finger to the next line. Now connect that to the balloon default trigger. If the lender decides inventory value drops below this ratio, the full balance can accelerate. Not next year. Not after missing a payment. Immediately. One director on the screen frowned. But why would the lender do that if the company is growing? Brian looked at Carl, then back at the board. Because growth makes this company vulnerable before cash arrives. Monica's supermarket orders require inventory now, payment later. Under this clause, the lender can exclude that inventory until the receivables clear. So the company can be successful in real life and still look weak under the loan formula. The room went quiet, but not silent yet. Carl Jennings stood from his chair. This is a distorted reading. Every lender needs collateral control. Mr. Harris is presenting ordinary protections as a scheme because he is angry about being terminated. Brian opened the second folder. That is why I brought the log. He slid a printed revision history beside the clause. Outside counsel approved version 7 at 10:42 a.m. The attorney left the negotiation call at 10:58. Version 8 was uploaded at 11:10 by Jennings Capital's portal credentials. That is when borrower certified became lender determined. At 11:14, the balloon acceleration cross-reference was added. At 11:22, the AI summary was generated from the clean label, but it failed to connect the 2 sections. Erin Vale, the junior attorney, stepped forward and placed her own copy beside his. Our system confirms those timestamps. Carl's face hardened. A portal credential is not a person. Brian nodded once. Correct. That is why the receipt matters. He pulled out the last page, a vendor receipt from the secure document platform, showing a paid rush upload request tied to Carl's brokerage account and labeled covenant language finalization. The amount was small. The consequence was enormous. This receipt does not prove he typed the words himself, Brian said. It proves his office paid to finalize the covenant language after legal approval and before signature. And his certification states no material covenant changes were made after legal review. Monica's hand moved to the edge of the table. For a moment, the whole story rearranged itself in front of her. Brian in the boardroom saying do not sign it. Brian in the hallway pointing to the timestamp. Brian in the lobby while Ava held her library book and listened to people call her father reckless. Carl tried to speak again, but the outside counsel interrupted from the screen. That certification is a problem, the CFO added. The lender freeze happened less than an hour after closing. That means the trigger was not theoretical. Brian turned to the factory dashboard on the wall, where delayed supplier payments, payroll warnings, and the frozen operating account sat in red. This is how the bankruptcy risk starts, he said. First, the lender questions eligible inventory value. Second, the funds freeze. Third, suppliers stop shipments. Fourth, production slows. Fifth, investors panic. Sixth, the company needs emergency bridge money. And the same network that created the emergency offers rescue in exchange for control rights. He did not make the explanation complicated. He did not need to. The trap was terrifying because, once shown plainly, everyone could understand it. Monica looked at Carl. Did your partners prepare a bridge control proposal before the lender review? Carl said nothing. Aaron opened another email record from the closing folder. The draft bridge proposal was created yesterday. That was when the room finally went silent. Not boardroom quiet. Not professional quiet. The deeper kind of silence that arrives when status stops protecting someone and the paper starts speaking for itself. Brian looked down at the loan clause page with balloon default trigger, then at Ava, then back at the people who had dismissed him. Power talks first. Proof talks last. No one moved. Carl Jennings sat slowly, his confidence draining into the polished floor. Monica Gray, the CEO who had fired a single dad for refusing to sign, stared at the clause that could have taken her company, her employees' paychecks, and her control, and for the first time she understood that Brian had not been blocking growth. He had been standing between her and bankruptcy. The public reversal began not with applause, but with Monica Gray standing in the same boardroom where she had dismissed Brian Harris and asking the cameras on the emergency investor call to stay on. The directors were still present on screen. The CFO sat beside a frozen cash forecast. Aaron Vale had the revision logs organized in a clean stack. The loan clause page with balloon default trigger remained in the center of the table, no longer treated like a nuisance from a fired assistant, but like the evidence that had pulled the company back from the edge. Monica looked at Brian first, then at the board. Earlier today, I removed Brian Harris from this transaction and from this company because I believed he was interfering with a critical financing round, she said. Her voice did not shake, but everyone could hear the effort it took to keep it steady. I was wrong. Carl Jennings stared at the table. He had already been asked to surrender his access badge and step away from the loan file, while outside counsel began a formal review. His brokerage firm had been notified that the board was freezing all work connected to his office pending an audit of the revision history, the certification, the lender communications, and the bridge control proposal drafted before the so-called emergency. No one shouted at him. No one needed to. The documents had done what anger could not. Monica turned toward the investor call. The company will not proceed under the disputed terms. We are notifying the lender that the covenant language was materially altered after legal review, and we are preserving all records for counsel, auditors, and the board. The CFO added that payroll would be protected through a reserve account and that supplier payments would be prioritized manually until the bank freeze was lifted. Operations confirmed the factory would stay open through the night shift. A few workers watching from the glass hallway did not know every legal detail, but they understood enough. Their jobs had almost become leverage in someone else's game, and the man they had seen escorted out had helped stop it. Monica faced Brian again. Mr. Harris, your termination is rescinded effective immediately. Your record will reflect that you raised a valid compliance objection. The board will also create an independent risk review role reporting outside the deal team, and I would like you to lead that process. The room waited for relief, gratitude, maybe even victory. Brian gave none of those performances. He stood beside Ava's chair, one hand resting lightly on the back of it while she held her library book about money against her lap. His face was tired, calm, and careful. "I appreciate the correction," he said, "but I need a boundary made part of the record." Monica nodded. "Say it." Brian looked at the directors, then at the workers in the hallway, then at Ava. "No employee should be fired, threatened, or humiliated for refusing to sign off on a document they believe is unsafe. Compliance has to mean more than protecting the company from regulators. It has to protect the company from its own panic." The sentence settled into the room with more weight than any apology could. Monica accepted it publicly. The board chair agreed to a written policy review. Aaron Vale was assigned to preserve the file and work with outside counsel. Carl Jennings was removed from the building by security, not in a dramatic scene, but in the quiet, realistic way powerful people leave when the room no longer believes their version. As he passed the doorway, he did not look at Brian. Brian did not look for him. He was helping Ava zip her backpack, making sure the corners of the library book did not bend. Monica watched that small gesture and understood why he had seen the danger before everyone else. He lived in a world where details mattered, where late fees, grocery totals, rent dates, and fine print could change a life. That was not weakness. That was training. By the end of the night, the payroll hold was released, the equipment vendor agreed to extend the deadline, and the board paused the financing until clean terms could be negotiated. The company had not been saved by ego, speed, or a powerful title. It had been saved by a single dad who kept records, read the small print, and refused to put his name on a lie. By the time Brian Harris and Ava stepped out of Monica Gray Foods, the night air felt softer than the lobby lights they had left behind. There were still meetings happening upstairs, attorneys preserving records, board members reviewing policies, and factory supervisors calling workers to confirm the morning shift would continue. But Brian was not thinking about headlines, apologies, or the look on Carl Jennings' face when the audit team took his access away. He was thinking about the library drop box across town and whether he could still get Ava's book returned before the building closed. Ava walked beside him with her small hand in his, the library book about money tucked safely under her arm, her backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulders. "Dad?" she asked. "Were you scared in there?" Brian looked down at her and almost gave the easy answer adults give children when they want to sound stronger than they are. Instead, he told her the truth. "Yes," he said, "but being scared does not mean you stop reading the page." Ava thought about that as they reached the old pickup. The cardboard box of his desk thing sat on the passenger seat, and on top of it was the folded loan clause page with balloon default trigger, no longer spread open like a weapon, no longer circled and pointed at under angry lights. Brian picked it up carefully and slid it into a plain folder between his notebooks. It had done its job. It had protected people who never knew his name, workers who would clock in tomorrow, drivers who would load trucks, families who needed payroll to clear, and a CEO who had almost mistaken speed for wisdom. But Brian did not feel like a man who had won. He felt like a father who had shown his daughter something more important than victory. How to stand still when a room tries to push you. How to keep records when people rewrite stories. How to let proof speak without turning bitter. And how to leave with your character cleaner than the room that misjudged you. They drove through quiet streets past closed storefronts, gas stations, and apartment windows glowing with ordinary lives. At the library drop box, Ava placed her book inside and listened to it slide down into the dark. "No late fee," she said, smiling a little. Brian smiled too. "No late fee." On the way home, she opened her notebook and wrote one sentence across the top of a blank page. "Proof is how you show your work." Brian did not correct her handwriting. He did not add a lesson. He just let the sentence sit there, simple and strong. The next morning, people would talk about the loan, the audit, the board reversal, and the broker who had pushed terms that could have broken a company. Some would call Brian brave. Some would call him stubborn. Some would still never understand why a man with so little power risked the little he had left. But Ava would know. She had seen him fold the evidence safely instead of waving it around for revenge. She had seen him protect his name without destroying his dignity. She had seen that being overlooked does not make a person small, and being powerful does not make a person right. Brian Harris was still a single dad, still careful with groceries, still checking bills at the kitchen table, still the kind of man who wrote dates in notebooks and returned library books on time. But now Ava understood the identity beneath all of that. He was a man who refused to sign what he knew was wrong. And sometimes the quietest person in the room is the only one standing between a family, a company, and a future someone else tried to steal.